this is a really cool idea for a community forum, and I'm really excited to get to kick it off. Don't worry about writing anything down, except your questions. I'll stay as long as you need. If something up on a slide that you didn't get and you want to make sure you get before you go, we'll make sure you get that information before you take off. This is another first for me, the first time I'm giving a talk knowing that any fumble I make will be inescapably permanently online for trolls to find, so hope that goes well. And as Tim said, write down questions. If there's something that I say and you don't understand, can't hear me, go ahead and ask for clarification right away, but generally write down questions for the end. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you. All right. So, clean, healthy food, well-supported farmers, animal welfare, environment, wildlife, and community. That's a lot to put in one package, right? And it's a lot more to try to identify and explain in a label on that package. So how do we use labels to get more of what we want? Okay, first a disclosure. As a sustainable livestock vet, I work with a lot of farms, a lot of companies that develop, audit, and enforce standards, and folks who are trying to sell food or trying to work to promote sustainable agriculture. I need to tell you that I am not authorized to speak for any of those people today. What I say today is myself speaking, just as me, Jen Burton, and as representative of Wellness Ecology, a company dedicated to sustainable food and health systems. Okay. Any information and images that you see or that I share, these things are publicly available online. So not sharing any information that is specific to any company. Okay. Back in my research days, I spent that portion of my career looking at complex systems. Getting environmental scientists, veterinarians, people who train soldiers to drive tanks to talk with each other. We did that for the purpose of figuring out how each person understood the different parts of a system, how those understandings can come together and help us all understand the system better, and ultimately to figure out how we can manage a landscape better to meet everyone's needs. Now, am I an expert on chemical residues from munitions, how to teach soldiers to drive tanks, and what the striped newt looks for in a mate? Absolutely not. So my job was to bring some expertise to the table, but also to get people to talk to each other in a common language, find a common language, and create a space where we could all share ideas, try things out, ask what would happen in this space if, whether it was right or wrong, just a safe place to explore ideas. So that is an ecological approach to problem solving. And it's the kind of approach that I think we need when we're talking about food systems. Okay, at their family-owned brewery across town, Matt Riggs once opened a sustainability initiative speech by saying, sustainability is hard and we're not perfect. And what I learned from ecological systems research is that the answers are really nice when you can find them. But where it's really at is in asking the questions and having a group of people present to talk about those questions and try to figure things out. The most important thing that anyone can do, I think, is to be at the table, to be present and to participate in the conversation. So let's start with this idea of clean food. Why is this a concern? Why is that concern controversial? Okay. Pesticides, including fungicides, herbicides, these are chemicals that farmers use because pests, fungus, weeds, eat, cause disease in, destroy, damage, compete with the crops that they're growing. At some point in time, farmers learned that by using these chemicals, they could grow more food in less space with less risk. And when I say risk, I mean risk of a catastrophic event that could destroy their farm, destroy their family, destroy their crop that year. Okay, so while exposure to those chemicals, pesticides, has been associated with a slew of adverse health effects, most of the knowledge that we have about that has to do with large single or larger dose exposures or short-term exposures. We can go on and on about the kinds of illnesses, injuries, cognitive malfunctions, behavioral changes, learning disabilities that we see in children and adults exposed to significant doses of these chemicals. We know that chemicals cause health problems. What we don't know for sure is if those health problems are necessarily associated with low-dose, long-term exposure, the kind of exposure that you would get if those chemicals were in your food. Well, that's not entirely true. We know for a few of those items. We know that some cancers in some populations are a little more likely when people are exposed to these chemicals in that long-term, low-dose way. We know that atrazine, let's see here, the insulin resistance and increased risk for diabetes in rats, not yet shown in humans, caused by atrazine can be caused by low-dose, long-term chronic exposure. But for the most part, we just don't have that evidence. So that's one of the reasons that the question about clean food is a little bit controversial. We're not sure that what's in food, or that's what is used to grow food, necessarily would cause the same problems when it's in food that it causes in high doses. Here are some things that we do know. In 2018, one research group looked at a slew of different produce, fruits and vegetables, meats, eggs, dairy products sold in the US. They found 225 different pesticides, residues in those foods at detectable levels, in nearly 70% of the produce sold in the country. They wanted this study to be relevant to how we use the produce, so they washed it, still present. They peeled it, present. So those 225 different pesticides in 70% of the produce is what's left after washing and peeling. Like I said, we know many of these substances cause adverse health effects, but we don't know for sure that as residue in food that they can do that. We also know that the diet is the primary source for a lot of residues that make it into our bodies, but not for all. So some studies that find residues in people's bodies, those exposures may or may not be dietary. Home and lawn chemicals, pesticides used on pets could be another source, are for sure another source for some of those products. We know that when we're looking at one class of pesticides, proof that the item was not only entered the body but was processed, metabolized in some way, is present in about 70% of the people sampled in the general population. So we know it's being used in agriculture, we know it's making it into the food, we know it's making it into people's bodies, and we know that there's some interaction between the chemical and people's bodies. I also want to point out that this talk today is about labels. So it's what you can know from reading a label. It's not commentary on what farmers are doing. Many farmers are using these products sparingly. Some farmers that don't have labels or certifications to prove it may not be using them at all. Okay, but we're talking about labels. Oh, the first one that I want to talk a little bit about is organic. This study was just published a couple months ago. This researcher tested the urine of adults and children for 18 different substances that are used as agricultural pesticides. He then had the people switch to an organic diet, gave a little time for washout, and tested again. These were urine samples. So of 18 pesticides that he looked for, 14 were found in the urine. 13 of them were found in much lower concentration after the families had been on an organic diet for just a few weeks. He didn't mean to do the last part of the test, but he messed up samples for one of the families, so he asked if they were willing to switch back off of the organic diet so he could run the tests again. And they did, and he did, and the levels came back up to where they had been in the other families on non-organic diets. Okay, so if you are looking to avoid these kind of chemicals in your food, there's really one program that's widespread use in the US, and that is organic certification. Organic farmers are by the rules, and these are USDA, so government rules, are not allowed to use most of the chemicals that we're talking about when we talk about agricultural pesticides. Now, organic is a national program. It's a government program. This is the national seal. There are a slew of certifiers, so you may see a different seal that still says organic. If it says organic, it is audited or certified, inspected under the same rules. And I wanted to point out this Demeter Biodynamic. You may not see the word organic on those packages, but everything that is certified under Demeter also meets all organic standards. Okay, so let's say you're interested in eating organic food in order to avoid chemicals, but it's a big change. Where might you start? The Environmental Working Group takes a look every year at a whole bunch of fruits and vegetables that are raised and sold in the US, and they name what they call their dirty dozen. It's the top 12 items, produce items most likely to contain significant levels of kinds of pesticides that we've just talked about. So this is their dirty dozen list for this year. It just came out in the last couple of weeks. And again, if you're interested in avoiding pesticides in food, these are probably some of the most important foods to look at. So this issue of chemical content is pretty cut and dry. The question about nutrition, less so. So when you read that a potato contains 42 milligrams of vitamin C, where's that information from?
What you need to know about that information is that it's standardized. So this is a USDA database, and when those measurements were taken, they didn't account for different
varieties, different ways of growing the produce, even different age. Is an older apple different than a newer apple? We don't know. It's not in the USDA database. They definitely did not account for organic soil types or qualities. The other thing that you need to know about that database is that some of those measurements were taken in 1960.
The database is updated regularly, but not every food is retested.
So, about 10 years ago, a researcher looking at fruits and vegetables thought that he was seeing a trend
that mineral concentrations were declining. So he did some measurements on his own.
And also did some reviews from research over time that had taken actual measurements. Mineral levels had been declining over time, so had vitamin levels, and so had protein in some foods. He came up with two reasons for this. One, he calls the dilution effect. So as crops are bred for a higher yield, which means more plants in the same amount of space, his observation is that there is less mineral available for each plant because we have the same soil, more plants, less mineral for each one. Perhaps a more surprising and more conclusive test, he did side-by-side plantings of low-yield and high-yield varieties, many grains, and at least one vegetable, broccoli. So now we're talking about different plants in the same soil. And what he found was that the plants that were bred for higher yield took up less nutrients, less minerals. And his theory on that was that that's one of the reasons they're able to yield more plants, more produce, more broccoli, more grain per acre, is that the plants are less needy, which is great for the plants, it's great for the volume, but not so great for the food quality. So what I think we know from this kind of study is that high yield varieties
are probably going to have less nutritional density than low yield varieties. That means
heirloom produce, many, but not all, of the breeds, the varieties that are bred for organic use, and heritage breed livestock. Now, there's not a perfect correlation there, but we know, at least in poultry, that the meat of heritage breed poultry tends to have more protein than the meat of non-heritage breeds. And similarly, those non-heritage breeds tend to be newer animals that were bred for higher production. Heritage breeds tend to be slower growing, not such high yield. Okay, so we've got a good handle on a relationship between yield and nutrition, But science is still having a hard time sorting out what that means for organics. Some studies find differences between organic and non-organic products in terms of nutritional content, and others don't. The reason for that, as far as we can tell, is that there's a lot of variation within organics. Production varies from a very small subsistence to CSA scale to an industrial scale. Soil management varies widely, all within standards, but there's a lot of room for people to do their own thing within those standards. The bottom line for organics is that they may tend to give you better nutrition, but you can't be certain of that just by looking at the label. Okay, let's talk about grass-fed. So when you see a grass-fed label, if it's legitimate, it is referring to an animal that can do well on grass or on forage alone. It doesn't have to be grass, it can be plants in a slightly different class. So we're talking about beef, lamb, and goat. We're talking about dairy products, not pigs or poultry. And the big nutritional difference here is pretty well delineated. It is the content and the quality of the fats. So truly grass-fed meat and dairy tends to be much higher in omega-3 fatty acids compared to omega-6. Now, omega-3s are that group that most of us probably don't get enough of. Part of their role in the body is to mitigate and suppress inflammation. Not in a bad way, not to prevent you from healing, but to keep it from getting out of control. Omega-6s have the opposite effect, so they tend to be responsible for inflammation getting out of hand or being more systemic rather than localized to where it's needed. This term has a legal definition for meat. So meat labeling is overseen by the USDA. Dairy labeling is overseen by the FDA. So that's why there's such a big difference. There are legal rules
for the use of the term grass-fed on meat. And in general,
for meat, the grass-fed labels are more regulated, and grass-fed meats are more common. There are no legal rules for use of this term on dairy. It's less regulated, and frankly, grass-fed dairy is more difficult to do. With meat, what you're trying to get the animal to do is grow. If they're not growing, they're not performing well as a meat animal. With dairy, the animal is making milk. It is possible for the animal to be losing weight and still making milk, and that's where you can run into trouble with grass-fed dairy. Many farmers do this beautifully, and when it's done well, it's a really nice thing to see because feeding only grass has some benefits for the cow and for the management system. But I would urge you, if you're looking for this higher omega-3 content, if you're looking to get that from grass-fed dairy, I would urge you to look not only for a grass-fed label, but also for a meaningful animal welfare label. So 2
grass-fed labels that you're most likely to see that are meaningful are shown on the board. I use the term meaningful, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of a label. It means that
the standards can be expected to achieve the desired outcome. For grass-fed animals can be expected to achieve healthy, productive animals that are fed grass and not the things that you don't expect in a grass-fed program like grain. Someone who knows what they're looking at is checking to see if farms are actually adhering to the standards, and farms that don't adhere to the standards don't end up using the label. So that's what I mean by meaningful. And that's a lot. If you think that that is a lot for you or me as a consumer to look at a package and try to figure out if those things are happening, you're in luck, because somebody else is doing a really good job of it for us. Consumer Reports, I bet that you guys have all heard of them, right? Like if you want to buy a washing machine or a car, they do such a nice job of rigorously, objectively comparing products on the points that you care about. They're a really nice company. They've been doing that for a long time. Now they're doing it with food labels. So their database is called Greener Choices. If you just Google Consumer Reports Greener Choices, you'll find this. And it's also true that programs, standards, audit programs, labels can change frequently, and these guys are doing a pretty good job of keeping up. So I recommend this as a resource if you want to learn about a new label that you've seen, or if there's a specific attribute that you're looking for. Okay, so now I would like to ask you to take a moment to picture what you think a natural pork product should be. What does the product look like? What does the farm look like where natural pork comes from? I'll give you a moment. Okay. Raise your hand if you're picturing Spam. Nobody? Well, if you're not picturing Spam, you are in the vast majority. So this hit the news within the last week. The consumer group sued the Hormel company, which makes Spam, because their natural choice product was found to be using the same pork that they put in Spam. Consumers were really angry about this, as you might imagine. So how does something like this happen? Well, words on labels have a legal definition, and it doesn't really matter if what makes sense to us or what we think the word should mean, right? There's a legal definition behind it, and I'm going to tell you what the definition is for natural. Actually, I'm going to tell you what it isn't, because that will make more sense.
Address how animals or plants were raised. It does not address the use of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, antibiotics, hormones. It doesn't address housing for animals, shelter. It doesn't address whether animals had outdoor access.
Natural is just about the final product, and it has two main rules. Minimally processed, no synthetic ingredients. So if you open a can of soup and chicken that's in there, resembles chicken. The carrots look like carrots. You can tell they're carrots. They haven't been radically altered from what people think of as a carrot or what people think of as chicken. Then they're good on minimally processed. No synthetics, just
no artificial colors, flavors, or preservatives.
That's it. So that's how you get natural Spam. Spam wouldn't be natural because of preservatives, but that's how the same meat that goes into Spam can also be billed as natural. Okay. There's a lot more to say about non-GM than we have time for right now. Here's what I think you should know.
Many, many, many studies have been done in the 2 or so decades, 2.5 decades, since GM products came to the market. The perhaps impactful long-term study that is in process right now is asking what I think is the crucial question, and that is, what's going to happen if modified genes from GM food get into wild animals, wild plant populations, bacteria, and stay tuned. That question is going to be answered because those things are happening. Genes that were intended for food products, food plants, food animals are making their way into wild populations. We don't really know what's going to happen, but we will, because it's happening. If you want to avoid GMOs, here are really the main labels you want to look for. And organic farmers work really hard to implement a process that minimizes the risk of GM contamination of their crops. They use all non-GM seed. They give up some of the area that they could have planted to create buffer zones. Sometimes they're building or planting additional things, non-crops, in those buffer zones.
These other two labels are testing samples of product for contamination. Our last big group of topics is kind of animals and environment. So what I would like for you to know about animal welfare is it is its own science. But let's look at a couple of different systems so we can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about when we see things on labels. So this is conventional broilers. If you're eating chicken raised conventionally without any special labeling, it's likely that the bird was raised in a system like this, kind of a floor-based system, Not lonely. Laying hens, now this is a European system, the birds in the US look different, but this gives you an idea of what battery cages are about, what they look like. If you were to remove the dividers between the cages, you have cage-free. And if you open a door, you have free range. Okay, so free range systems often look like this, maybe a stationary building with birds out in a yard, maybe mobile housing where they're practicing a pasture rotation. So here's my question for you. What is the essential property that takes a system from cage-free to free range? Fields, grass, those are all, it's kind of like natural. Open a door. Yeah, they don't have to be outside. They don't have to touch grass or soil. They don't have to go outside at all.
That's free range.
If there's a door open in there somewhere that a bird can put fruit. Yes. Yep, birds could go outside if they could find the door. Yep. Okay. So my job in animal welfare would be so much easier if I could just walk up to an animal and say, cow, tell me about your life. How do you feel about this? What would you like me to do differently? What I want you to know is that animal welfare is its own science. It's looking at how animals are coping with their situation. It's looking at behavior, social. It's more than just health. It's more than just production, environment. But really, what are the animals telling us with how they behave, with what choices they make? Giving them choices so that we understand what they're looking for. For welfare, look for meaningful programs that integrate welfare science in addition to agricultural and veterinary health sciences. Because I work so closely in this field, I will not make much comment of my own. Here's what Consumer Reports has to say about what to look for. Look for these labels. I'll come back to that if anyone wants to write things down after. This one by itself. These two, if there's an additional audited claim that the animals are pasture raised. And this one, if it's level, so this is GAP and it has levels 1 through 5. This one if it's level 4 or higher. Okay, when we talk about wildlife, we're often talking about benefits to the ecosystem. Diversity, beneficial organisms, which are great pollinators, predators that prey on things we don't want, like insects. That's all wonderful, but I would say that a meaningful wildlife certification also has to look at the well-being of those creatures. Do they have appropriate breeding habitat available? Do they have access to it when they want to use it? Is it not occupied by cows during that time? Can they get to the food sources that they would typically use? How cool is it that there are whole, to tell farmers how to make a lay-down fence to let the antelope migrate across their property, teaching them calculations so they can figure out how high a fence has to be for an elk to get over it. Farmers who are doing this are definitely spending a little extra money. Being truly great to the wildlife brings in some interfaces where you might see parasite and disease issues both in the wildlife and in your farm animals. So again, we're looking for a meaningful program issue with wildlife predator management, and we're looking for programs that practice exclusion, deterrence, non-lethal control, that try to just make the wildlife decide on their own to stay out, making things that are stressful, scary, or lethal our last resort. Finally, when we talk about environment or ecosystem health, talking about air, water, and soil, which we largely addressed when we talked about chemical use. It's not the chemical use isn't the only issue with air, water, with water and soil, but it's a piece. Biodiversity we kind of talked about with wildlife, discussion of wildlife, and functional ecosystems. Wow, that's a really big, tough one. And boy, if we don't have all the answers with sustainability, we really don't have all the answers as far as how ecosystems work, what they need, what stabilizes them, what destabilizes them, and what they're doing for us. We don't even know what those functions are. It's hard to say that we're sure we're preserving them. So when you're looking at environmental labeling for food, I would recommend programs that meaningfully address soil and water, animal welfare, including wildlife, and social impact of the farm. And that acknowledge existing systems, whether that's ecosystems, cultures, the economics of the area, with an understanding that the ecosystem is, this group of systems, things working together, and that we want to look at what's happening before we start disrupting it if possible. And then environmental problems are just going to require ecological problem solving. I think what I'll do to keep us on track is save discussion of local, because it's not really a label, but I did want to talk about it a little bit. And summarize. So labels that are useful are labels that are really specific. Find out exactly what they mean. That Greener Labels, Greener Choices website can help. Those folks are checking to see that appropriate expertise is behind the label and that somebody's verifying it. A given label may not contain all the answers, so you may be looking for more than one thing, or you may have to think about what you really want if you have to choose between different labels. But the biggest things are just to stay at the table, keep asking questions, and know that change takes time, and keep the conversation civil. Be a good neighbor. Speaking of being a good neighbor, I would like to thank Tim and NutriCycle for creating this space where we can explore ideas and kind of find our way forward. Thank you guys all for being here. Yeah, so research regarding GMO products. What is the length of the study of human impacts on humans? So that's really the crux of the entire GMO discussion. We've had about 22 years since GM products entered our food system. There are lots of little studies on rats and bees and lab animals, and there are a few studies trying to look at differences between kids who were raised on non-GM versus GM food. But it hasn't been that long, and that's, I think we're going to know a lot more. Answer your question? Yeah. And then, similar question for pesticide study. Are the studies looking at effects over long terms? So that is one of the biggest concerns about the studies that are out there. There are great laboratory studies with shorter duration of exposure, higher dose. But that long-term chronic residue level in dietary exposure is something that's really hard to look at, and it would be considered unethical to create a study in which you had this group of humans eat a little bit of pesticide every day for 40 years. So those are always, they can never meet the top-notch scientific rigor. Peer-reviewed, placebo-controlled, randomized, double-blind litmus that science would like to see. I so wish that we had good data comparing healthcare costs for people who eat organic or non-GM and people who don't. Comparing sick days. But we don't. So all we have really is the price tags at the grocery store, right? Yeah, I don't know. There may be some experts on various aspects of this in the audience. Is there anyone who would like to talk about the cost? I'm going to back up and say one more thing before I do that. The Dirty Dozen, I think, is a pretty good place to start, like changing one thing at a time. Trying to just transition to organic in the things that we know are the most contaminated. We didn't really talk a lot about the local, but one of the one of the benefits of local is being able to ask hard questions like, why does your stuff cost more than this other stuff? And organic, because it costs more, it sometimes has a reputation for being more elite, and I don't know why all organic costs more, but I do know why some of our local organic costs more. Yeah, so and justifying the cost doesn't make the money magically appear in your bank account, right? So my best answer to that is pick one thing at a time and make slow change. You heard it accurately. So this was a study that looked at, National Institute of Health isn't quite right. It looked at a large database of samples that were taken across the general population, and from that database, 70% of the people who had been sampled came up positive for pyrethroids or metabolic byproducts of pyrethroids. So they had had some significant exposure enough that it was detectable in their systems. In the US, yep. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. I know at least 2 people in this room used to walk around with a backpack sprayer when they were little kids, like spraying Roundup on thistles in their barnyard. And what we believed about it then was that it had no impact on human health and it left no residue. So it was there, killed the weeds, and was gone. Somewhere around maybe 10 years ago, someone realized there is a residue. We just didn't have the scientific wherewithal to detect it 40 years ago. There is a residue, and glyphosate chelates or binds some minerals, which has a cascade of impacts on worms, microbes in the soil, and it has that same chemical action. It chelates minerals in the bodies of animals, including humans. And that's where the part that we all agree on ends. So the question is, what are the actual health effects? Number one, how much do we care about the ecosystem effects on worms, on what nutrients are bioavailable in the soil? And number two, what are the actual human health effects? So your question about kind of comparing Europe and the US, the difference is that Europe realized about 200 years ago that they were nearly out of arable land relative to their population. So Europe in general is much more proactive about preserving their ability to grow food over the long haul to feed the number of people that they have. And they operate on the precautionary principle, which is the idea that if we're not sure if the results of that experiment haven't come back, let's wait. And the US is not out of outstanding topsoil, we're not out of arable land, and we don't operate on the precautionary principle. Yeah.
Follow-up question, are there different methods of research for US versus Europe, or are there different people who are sponsoring that research in US and Europe?
So the question is, are there different methods, research methodologies, or different sponsors for the research? Like, why is the research looking different in different places? That's a good question. I don't have all the answers. The research on sponsorship for research suggests that sponsorship does impact outcomes. But who's sponsoring what worldwide, I don't know. One piece of this may be that we're looking at and agreeing on the outcomes of the research, that's the science piece, like what is, and then what we ought to do, what we decide to do, takes 2 different directions. Is there any labeling that identifies products based on their carbon contribution or climate impact? I do not know of a label that we would be likely to see here. And I'm not sure that my information is up to date. The last time I asked that question, a really cool organization, Abe Collins, the organization was called Carbon Farming, and so this was working with farmers to figure out how systems can maximize sequestration of carbon, minimize release of greenhouse gases. Whether there's a label associated with that now, I don't know. Thank you guys again. It was really an honor to open this up and really appreciate your being here.